Good evening and a huge welcome to everyone. What a great pleasure it is to be able to share this space and time, despite it being virtual, with all of you. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Yuko Handa, and I'm the Executive Director of the Japan Society of Boston. Before I proceed, I want to let you know that chat is open. Please send in your questions via chat and also let us know, where are you joining us from? Tonight's program is very special for two big reasons. First, we have the great honor to present tonight's event with an exceptional organization, the Japan America Society of Chicago. Thank you, Chicago friends, for joining us. It is also special because we will be talking about John Manjiro, who we at the Japan Society of Boston believe is our Dai Senpai, or someone who have paved the path for us in this important work we do of connecting Japan and the United States. This is the second part of our two-part series with the Japan America Society of Chicago on the stories of Japanese pioneers who first came to the United States. Last month, we learned about Tsura Umeko, who in 1871, at the age of 6, was one of the 5 women sent by the Meiji government to study in the United States. Manjiro preceded Umeko in coming to the US, and as we will learn today, he played a part in opening up Japan that led to the Meiji Restoration, which of course, among many other things, led Umeko into coming to the US. Therefore, we can probably definitely say that Manjiro is one of the very first bridge builder between the people of the US and Japan. There is no one better that I can think of than Jerry Rooney when it comes to telling the story of Manjiro. Jerry Rooney is the president and CEO of the Whitifield Manjiro Friendship Society. Rooney-san is also the recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun Gold and Silver Rays, a national decoration awarded by the Japanese government to those who have made distinguished contributions to the promotion of Japanese culture and achievements in international relations. Welcome, Rooney-san.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. And I should say Ohayo gozaimasu for all our friends who are in Japan, and konbanwa for all of those who are still with us in the USA. We are so thrilled to be able to assist in giving the rest of the audience a bit of additional information, hopefully, about Manjiro and how he affected not only the life in Japan, but the relationship between the two countries. So we look forward to doing that, and we invite later, if you have questions, please do submit them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rooney-san. We'd like to start with a short video on the background of John Manjiro before we ask Rooney-san to come back and share with us more details about not only Manjiro, but also Fairhaven, where Manjiro lived. Fairhaven is a small town in Massachusetts, but it has a big history, and Rooney-san will have plenty of stories to share with you about both Manjiro and Fairhaven. So with that said, Ian, I think we're ready for the video.
John Manjiro is considered by historians to be the first Japanese person to live in the United States of America. He is also quite possibly the first Japanese international student in the modern sense of the word. He was born in 1827 in the fishing village of Nakahama, part of the modern-day city of Tosa-Shimizu in the southwestern Kochi prefecture. He was only given the name Manjiro, as at the time of his birth, commoners did not hold enough status to warrant a surname. Manjiro was given the nickname John Mung during his time in the Western Hemisphere. After assisting Commodore Perry in the Shogun government with international relations under the name Jiki-san, he was allowed to take a family name. Once he earned the elevated status, he chose the name Nakahama, based on the name of the village he was from. Contemporary Tosa-Shimizu remains a geographically isolated city in Shikoku. Being one of the smallest cities in the prefecture, with a population of approximately 15,000, the city lacks non-road access, with the closest train station being an hour away and the closest airport being 150 kilometers away. At the time of Manjiro's birth, Tosa Shimizu was a part of the Tosa domain, and its seaside location made it, and nearby Ohama, traditionally ideal fishing villages. Seeing as his father passed away when he was 9 and his older brother had health issues, Manjiro was the primary male of the family, supporting the household financially from a young age. He worked for a local merchant family, milling rice and taking care of the children. According to legend, Manjiro ran away from his work due to the merchant's strict policies, swimming 2 kilometers to the neighboring fishing town Ohama, encountering fishermen from Nakahama. Joining them as a fisherman's apprentice, he was shipwrecked as a 14-year-old on Torishima in the Izu Island archipelago, surviving alongside 4 other fishermen. Prior to leaving for their fishing trip, they left from the port near the other's village of Usa, which can be seen as a possible omen of the USA. Surviving for 5 months on melted ice water, rainwater, migrating seabirds, and eventually on a diet of fish, they were rescued half a year later in 1841 by the whaling vessel John Howland, sailing out of New Bedford, Massachusetts. They were unable to return to Japan due to the strict Sakoku edicts of the time, which forbid the leaving of Japan, so the men were brought instead to Honolulu and Hawaii. When Captain Whitfield had witnessed Manjiro's mental awareness and curiosity aboard the John Howland, he decided to invite Manjiro to the USA for some formal education. Manjiro chose to seek knowledge and continued to Fairhaven.
Okay, if you like, I'll fill in a bit of the detail on this. For one thing, Manjiro's family, I think we've already learned that his dad died when he was 9 years old. His elder brother was very sickly. He had 2 older sisters and 1 younger sister. And his mother, Shiho-san, was really the brains and brawn of the family. But he was a commoner. Obviously, couldn't go to school and worked as he did, as was indicated in the script. Excuse me, when he went out to go fishing, he went with 4 other people. 3 of them were brothers. There was Fudenojo, who later changed his name to his uncle's name, Denzo, because the fellows on the John Howland ship couldn't pronounce it. Then there was Jusuke, his middle brother, and Goemon, and their neighbor, Torimon, went with him. So there were 5 altogether. Manjiro, being the youngest, had to do all the scrub work and the preparation of food and those kinds of things. In any event, they got caught in the storm, as indicated. They drifted to the island of Torishima, Bird Island, which is approximately 370 miles south of Tokyo. They were there in January, and of course, on June 27th, the Whitfield, John Howland ship under Captain William Whitfield came to that place. And according to the log, he said, this is June 27th, by the way, he said that they sent in 2 boats actually to look for turtles on that island. They had no idea there were people there. And of course, by the time those little boats got to the shoreline, the 5 people were down at the shore waiting to be rescued. So they took them aboard. And of course, they headed then for Hawaii. It took them till November to get to Hawaii. And when they got to Hawaii, Captain Whitfield looked up at one of his very good friends, a Reverend Judd, who had been there for many, many years. And actually along the way, they were not sure where these 5 young men had come from. They weren't sure that they could have been Chinese or Japanese or any of the Far East people. So he took them to Reverend Judd, and Reverend Judd had been there for many, many years in Hawaii. And when he brought them there, Reverend Judd brought out some of the memorabilia some other Japanese people had left him with kanji decoration, et cetera, et cetera. And when he showed them to these 5 people, they all went ecstatic and they were in joy because now finally Captain Whitfield knew that in fact they were Japanese. Okay, they left in December, and as indicated, they were heading to go around South America because there was no Panama Canal at the time. So this is December of 1841. They went all the way around South America and up to the East Coast and so forth. And on May 6th, they ended up finally coming into New Bedford Harbor. They reported to the ship owners and customs on that day and stayed over one day. the following day, they went to the Fairhaven, which we refer to as Manjiro's second hometown. And when they did, he actually entered a very small town with a huge history. And I think we can show you a little bit about that right now.
When Manjiro got on the John Howland, he was headed eventually for the town of Fairhaven, which is known as a small town with a big history. The main benefactor of the town was Henry Huddleston Rogers, Vice President of Standard Oil, who built some beautiful buildings, including this Unitarian church. And over here, we'll take a look at the Millicent Library, which contains so many of the Manjiro memorabilia. In 1892, when he built this town hall, he invited one of his best friends to come and make the speech, a fellow by the name of Samuel Clemens, as we know as Mark Twain. Mark Twain not only gave the speech, he wrote it by hand, and the original copy of the speech we will see later inside the Millicent Library. This is the original handwritten copy of the speech that Mark Twain gave in 1904 when they dedicated the new town hall. He was a good friend of Henry Huddleston Rogers. We were in the Millicent Library looking at the historic signature book, and as you can see, one of the famous people that came here often was Samuel Clemens, whom we also know as Mark Twain. He was a frequent visitor with Henry Huddleston Rogers. Also, in 1918, Toichiro, Manjiro's first son, wanted to present a sword to the town of Fairhaven in thanksgiving for the hospitality to his father. He could not bring it, so it was brought by the Japanese ambassador, Viscount Ishii, who signed the book here, as well as Calvin Coolidge, who was in attendance, later became our president. As well as these folks, we had a very important visit in 1987 by Akihito and his wife Michiko, who would, in a few more months, become the Emperor and Empress of Japan. He started a new era, and later, after 30 years, actually retired. It was the first time the Emperor had retired. We're here in the Millicent Library, looking at a display case that has a number of things pertaining to Manjiro. One of them is this family photo featuring Toichiro, first son of Manjiro, and others in the family at that time. As we know, in 1918, a beautiful sword was presented to the town, but it was stolen later. Upon learning about that, a Japanese professor at Seton Hall University took about a collection and bought a replacement sword. This is the replacement sword for the one that was presented in 1918. Swordsmith experts say by chance that the second sword happens to be older than the first one. In 1870, Manjiro was on a ship in New York about to go to Europe with a delegation. He took one day and jumped a train and came back to Fairhaven and spent the night with the captain and his family. For that occurrence, he brought a number of little tokens. This being one of them is a coin of that time that he brought and distributed to his friends and family here. This, therefore, is the only thing we know Manjiro actually touched. This is the Old Stone School, the first school that Manjiro ever attended. When he came here, he was 16 years old, so he got some tutoring from the Allen sisters, who lived near the captain, so that he could catch up on the language and not be embarrassed with the youngsters. He was probably the oldest and biggest in the school. Here's the name of the teacher, Jane Allen. This building was built in 1828, cost $520.01. I don't know if that might have been the tax, but in any event, it's been here since that time. Shortly thereafter, there were new schools built in Fairhaven, and therefore this school building was closed. It became a storehouse for a while, and later became a church for a certain sect in the town. And then it eventually was renovated back to the schoolhouse as it was before, when the Crown Prince Akihito came to visit in 1987. Here we have a copy of Manjiro's ABCs, done in brushstroke method. And as you can see, he actually signed it as well as John Mung. It also includes the ampersand, the and sign, which sometimes is not taught directly with the ABCs in the USA. Here we can get an idea of Manjiro's drawing ability. This is Torishima as he remembered it, and much later, actually drew pictures of it. Here is his impression of the bridge between Fairhaven and New Bedford, which he thought was going to cause an accident, not knowing that the bridge would open as the ship itself passed through. This is the captain's house at 11 Cherry Street. And Manjiro came here with the captain on May 7th, 1843. He became the first Japanese person to live in the USA. This is the front reception area where most of our guests are greeted. This is the old fireplace that's been there all this time. And in 2008, this house was for sale. And Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, who was 97 at the time, heard about it, decided to raise funds, which he did, and therefore was able to buy and repair the house. And on May 7th, 2009, he brought 100 people, supporters from Japan, and dedicated the house and donated it to the town based upon the fact that our Whitifield Manjiro Friendship Society would operate it. At the time Manjiro lived with the captain, that window was not there. There's a similar window in the adjacent room. However, Manjiro was known to be very homesick, looking out these windows and thinking about Mother as he looked out at the bay. Therefore, this room has been determined to be the room that Manjiro stayed in. We are in the conference room of the museum, and these photos show at the top the original sword that was presented to the town by Toichiro. He did not come himself, but it was presented by Viscount Ishii, who is pictured on the bottom right side. He was the ambassador from Japan and came and presented the sword on July 4th, 1918. In the middle is a picture of Toichiro's daughter, Aya. And over here, we have a beautiful drawing of the John Howland ship done by one of our esteemed local artists, Arthur Moniz. He's well known for all his contributions to the whole Manjiro story. The Japanese writing on the right side is done by Ayako Runi, our Japanese consultant advisor.
We talk about Manjiro having arrived, and then the question is, how did he get home? Well, there were a lot of things in between, and what happened was the captain had a second konyakusha when he went out on that trip. His first wife had already died. When he came back, he went to New York for a wedding, and when he came back from that, probably a month or so after they arrived in Fairhaven, he bought a farm. And Manjiro spent much more time at the farm than he did at the captain's original house. Then later on, Manjiro went out on another whaling voyage. In this case, they went around Africa instead of South America. And when he came back from that whaling voyage, he was talking to the captain and said, you know, he'd really seriously like to think about getting home. And it happened to be 1849, and the captain told him about a little thing in California called the gold rush. So he and a friend shipped out of New Bedford Harbor on the Steiglitz, went around South America, all the way up to San Francisco, went to the gold field, spent about 4 months in the gold field, got about $600. And with that money, then he could book passage back to Hawaii to find out what happened to his friends. He did that. And by the way, it was the first time he had to buy a ticket, because prior to that, he always worked for his passage. And the ticket at that time from San Francisco to Honolulu was a great $25. Okay. I don't think you can get a mail on the ship for that by now. But anyway, and when he arrived in Hawaii, he was interested in what happened to his other friends. Well, the middle brother, Jusuke, who had in fact hurt his leg very badly at Torishima, died of that in Hawaii. Torimon, their neighbor, became a businessman in Hawaii and didn't want to go back. So the other two, there was just Funojo and Goemon and Manjiro who were going to go back. They were helped to buy a small boat, which they named the Adventurer. They found a large ship going to China, and they got actually Manjiro made a deal with the captain to say that he would work all the way to China on that ship if he would drop off his other two friends at in the port in Japan. And so when they left and headed out, they got to the point where they were at Okinawa, in the southern tip of Okinawa, and they took the small boat, put it over the side, and Manjiro was ready to stay on the ship. And the captain of that ship said, "No, you've been a great worker and you're a great friend and a good leader for those folks. You go with them." So the three of them went. They finally got back to Japan and Okinawa. They got arrested. They were interrogated. They were brought up to Kagoshima and interrogated for many, many months thereafter. And eventually, after a total of 10 years plus, he was allowed to go home to Nakahama. And of course, his mother had not heard from him in 10 years and wondering what happened. And when he got back, there was a great reunion, and she had the crazy pleasure of taking him to Oaxaca, to the cemetery, to show him the stone she had put up, thinking he was already dead. In any event, he was only home for a couple of weeks when he had to go to Kochi and start teaching. So he was very much in demand. And as most of you know, he brought so many things back to Japan with him. And when he was about 45 years old, he took a stroke, and that slowed him down quite a bit. And finally, he was living with Toichiro, his son, in Tokyo. He died in 1898 at 71 years of age, and he's buried at the Zoshigaya Cemetery in Tokyo. So, fantastic person. Japan owes a lot to the modification of Japan to this young man. And we, in both ends, owe a lot to him in terms of the wonderful relationship we have to this date.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerry-san. I feel like we got the full story of Manjiro in such a short period of time. And I think this is definitely thanks to you and your deep knowledge of Manjiro. I have the great pleasure of starting the Q&A session, and I have a few questions of my own. So we've been talking about Manjiro a little bit. We've talked about Fairhaven a little bit, but we did not talk about Captain Whitifield much. And I also understand that the Whitifield Manjiro family have had relationships ever since, right? Ever since the 1843 in certain ways, 1841, 1843.
That is very true, Yuko-san, because even we understand that even during the Second World War, there was a way in which they mandated that they would keep together. Some people thought it was through the Red Cross by exchanging information there, but they were very much concerned about the other's fate given the hostilities, and they kept very close, as they do today. The fifth generation descendant of Manjiro there are three girls, the daughters of Hiroshi Nakahama, and one of them is single, living in Nagoya with her mother, who just passed only 4 months ago, by the way. In any event, they keep in touch all the time with the Whitifield family, and we know that very well from Bob Whitifield, whose fifth generation descendant happens to be also on our board of directors and meets us on Zoom every month. So yes, they're very much tuned into each other, and they keep up.
So in certain ways, really, I wasn't lying when I said John Manjiro is probably the first bridge builder between the people of the United States and Japan.
I think that's a great analogy. Yes, bridge building. Yes.
We're already, actually, I'm getting a lot of questions in my direct message. So I think I'm going to jump into questions if you don't mind. The first question being, how was Manjiro involved in opening up of Japan when Commodore Matthew Perry came to Japan?
Commodore Perry went first in 1853 with the black ships, as they called them. They were the ones who burned the coal and so forth. And they asked the government to consider opening some ports in Japan. And Matthew Perry said that he would return in the next year, in 1850, for the answer. During that year, Manjiro was brought to Edo, the old name of Tokyo, and he was then attached to the shogun, became Jiki-san, and assisted when Matthew Perry came back. However, when Perry came back, we understand that he was not allowed to translate directly in verbal manner because having spent so much time with the West, he might favor the USA. So he did a lot of transcriptions in writing and also was behind the screen when the others were translating in verbal.
So this is, we should imagine ourselves, this is, right after the closure of Japan ended, right? Right after 300 years of Japan being really isolated and closed off to the rest of the world. And this is when the Meiji Restoration is happening and the Meiji government is bringing in, right before the Meiji government comes into power. So is that the reason why there was a little ambivalence to have somebody translate directly with Commodore Matthew Perry?
Yes, I believe that's correct. Yes, and and as I was already previously mentioned, it was at that time because of his status he was finally allowed to take a family name, which he took from Nakahama and made Nakahama the family name. Yes.
Right, which is also interesting, just as a side story, but commoners or farmers didn't have a last name, right?
That's correct.
Took it from something. So one of the most popular Japanese surnames in Japan, Suzuki, means a tree with a bell tree. So it's said to be that they must have lived close to a tree that probably rang like a bell, and I guess that's why Manjiro took the name Nakahama, right?
Sounds right, yes. And when they came back, finally, in 1854, by the way, they opened two ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, up in the north. And Hakodate happens to be the same latitude as we are here in the Boston area.
Oh, very interesting, very interesting. Lots of questions. What does Hmong mean? Hmong, he used the word Hmong. And any reason why he used that?
I'm not too sure. I believe it's an interpretation of the kanji character that he has for his name, but others, maybe Peter or someone knows much better about that than I do.
Actually, another question about, we're going to go back to when John Manjiro returned to Japan, there's a question that says, are there documents or materials that tell us more about Manjiro's experience once back in Japan? And if so, where are they?
Well, when he was there in 1852, he was assigned to a writer, Kawada Shoryo, who was a writer and artist. He actually lived with him. He was a fairly young guy, and he dictated the adventures for all 10 years. And he wrote it down as Hyosan Kiriyaku, and drifting to the southeast. And we understand there are only 7 copies of that in the world. And one of them is in the Millicent Library in Fairhaven. And so some years back, one of our very precious members of our organization, Junji Kitadai, who's a Manjiro scholar, came with Jun and Nagakuni, and they translated that Japanese into English, and it was published by Spinner Publication in New Bedford, and it's called Drifting to the Southeast, which we use in our teaching courses, by the way.
Fantastic. Actually, I'm going to go all places because we're getting a lot of questions. A more practical question of, can I come and visit Fairhaven and the museum now? What are the protocols?
Absolutely, yes. Our website is www.whitfield-manjiro.org. In there, you can see the opportunities we have. We give, by appointment, obviously, we give tours of the museum itself. We also give tours of what we call the Manjiro Trail, which are 8 places around, some of which you saw in the video before, including the library and so forth. And we show people around that. which ends up at the museum itself. That's the last part of the tour. The tour of the museum itself takes about 50 minutes. We show a whole bunch of documents and so forth afterwards. The tour of the Manjiro Trail takes about 2.5 hours, including the museum itself. And all of these are done by arrangement and appointment. We were closed until June 6th of this year, and we now reopened, and we've had quite a number of people coming. We're certainly going to invite everyone to come down and see where Manjiro and Captain Whitfield shared time and space.
Fantastic. Actually, there's also questions for you. Jerry-san, how did you get involved with Manjiro's story?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a long story, but I'll try to short. My wife is Japanese, Ayako Miyata. And after 5 years in the Air Force, flying over Europe and 15 times never landing, I got out of the Air Force, decided to take a trip around the southern part of Europe. I thought maybe 2 or 3 months. I got home 3.5 years later. I'd run around the world for 3.5 years on a motor scooter, which is in my garage. I rehabbed it in any event. And I came down back to my home, which is in Wilmington, north of Boston. That's where I left from. And a missionary priest, Sacred Heart priest, who very often was in Fairhaven at their headquarters, I met in Japan. He came back to the United States, to the Regina Pacha Center in New Bedford, and got in touch with me to come down and work with the multilingual people at that place. And in the meanwhile, while I was traveling, my wife came over through the same Sacred Heart priest to go to college at UMass Dartmouth, thinking she's going to go home after a degree. But in any event, and she and her American mother came to that little church for Sunday service. And when we went down for coffee afterwards, I didn't know anyone but the priest, but the woman said to me, well, you must be Jerry. I understand you speak Japanese. This is Ayako. So she thought we were going to get a degree and head home to Ibaraki Prefecture. And here we are. We just celebrated 52 years of marriage here we live in Acushnet, actually.
So in certain ways, similar to John Manjiro, there's a lot of U.S.-Japan stories, U.S.-Japan connections, and obviously yours is one of it.
Oh, yeah, actually, yeah. The one we talk about things that are meant to be. When I was there with that priest in Japan, he ran a kindergarten for 120 kids. I spent 3 days with him, met the Kocho sensei, the teachers, the cook, the janitor, and all of them. We did a cookout for them. We did a song fest with the guitar, and then I went home. When I met Ayako and talked to her, it turns out her hometown is about 150 miles away from that kindergarten, but she used to teach there and knew the same teacher, principal, cook, janitor that I met 50 years ago.
Wow. And that is actually reminding me of that sort of a fate, as you call it, right? We saw in the video about the fishing town was USA, where
right.
When you write it in English, it's USA, right?
Right.
It's almost like, wow, it must have,
I think it's some kind of an omen.
Yes, yes. More questions. Will Manjiro Festival happen next year? And can you tell us, to those of us who don't know about the Manjiro Festival, what is the Manjiro Festival? Okay.
When Akihito-san came in 1987, and he very shortly thereafter became the Tenoheka, a group from our area went to Tosa Shimizu and signed Shimaitoshi, Sister City Agreement. So for 34 years, we've had exchanges back and forth. Okay, and then so every on a 2-year cycle, on the odd year, we have a Manjiro Festival in Fairhaven. On the even year, they have the same one in Tosa Shimizu. They had to cancel theirs last year because of the COVID, and we had to do the same this year because of COVID. So hopefully next year, they will be having their festival and we will travel there for it.
How is John Manjiro connected to Wellfleet on the Cape?
To where?
Wellfleet on the Cape.
Wellfleet. That I'm not sure, but I think Peter might know about that. Peter Gurley? Maybe not. I'm not aware of Manjiro and the Wellfleet itself.
Oh, okay. Well, more questions. Actually, there's a comment that says, don't you think it's time that a top quality film is made about John Manjiro? hint, hint, come on, NHK or Netflix, come on. This is a pretty amazing story. Not just about, I think, US and Japan, but really the friendship between John Manjiro and Captain Whitfield.
Yeah. Way back in, I have to think about 20 years ago, maybe, the Brothers Three did a song about Manjiro. Yes, and it was recorded. In fact, at one time I knew it. They made me sing it every time I went over there.
Interesting, wonderful. Is there any document left about his four friends that was left in Hawaii, besides the fact that one unfortunately passed away and one became a businessman, and two returned with him, right, to Japan?
Yeah, two returned. Of course, Fudenojo, or Denso as they later called him, was the skipper of that boat. So he returned, and so did Goemon, the youngest brother. A little side effect there was, we understand that Goemon deserted a wife in Hawaii when he left. But when we were over there one time for the festival, we were allowed to go to the gravesite of those other two people. And we were able to talk to the families there. It was very nice. Yeah.
Were they as involved in the process of opening Japan?
I'm not aware of that. I don't know. Yeah.
There's another question that says, you mentioned that Manjiro was a teacher in Kochi.
Yes. I mean, among other things, one of the things that he learned that was so useful to the Japanese Navy was kokai, navigation. He went to the Bartlett Academy here, learned navigation, brought it back. It's very interesting because he brought it back, and finally in 1860, the first Japanese ship could cross the ocean, the Pacific Ocean to California. The funny part of it was that the naval ships of Japan prior to that had to stay within the sight of land, and therefore they could never go out to the deep ocean. So now this whole group is heading over with Manjiro, and Fukuzawa-san was with him. And when they went out to the deep ocean and they got 3-meter waves, everyone got sick. So Manjiro ended up steering the ship into San Francisco. Wow. And it's because, that was a very interesting thing, because by the time he went back from that journey, one of the things he brought back was very influential, was a first sewing machine to Japan. And what happened was, Yagishi, some engineer, I guess, took it apart, and from that figured it out and made a typewriter from it. And from that, he expanded more and more and so forth. And then eventually he was so big and got so old that he retired, and his two sons took over the business. And of course, those two sons in English are brothers. And you now have a huge brothers firm that produces all of the copy machines and typewriters and so forth. And it came from the sewing machine Manjiro brought back.
Wow. Clarifying question. Is it correct that Manjiro did the first Japanese translation of Nathaniel Bowditch book on navigation?
I don't know if it was the first, but he definitely did translate it, yes.
So do you think there was obviously probably a relationship between the fact that he came to Fairhaven, right, which is a big, shipping, navigation, whaling town,
right,
versus 3-4 friends who went to Hawaii? Right.
Yes. Well, of course, Hawaii was very much in a kind of a naval type place, because anyone going across the Pacific Ocean on any kind of ship almost always had to stop at Hawaii just for provisions and all that.
But why is there a reason why, John Manjiro became the most famous of all these 5?
Of the 5 people that went with him? Oh, yes. Well, for one thing, he was very bright and curious. That's the precise reason why the captain thought it was such a shame that he was never allowed to go to school. So he made the offer to him when they got to Hawaii to continue back to the USA to get his first education. And being typically Japanese, he had said to the Captain Whitfield, I have to check with the Sencho, of course. In other words, the boss in the lining up of obligation kind of thing. And we understand that the others talked it over and said, we'll let Manjiro make his own decision. And he decided to come.
Interesting. Actually, before I ask the next question, there is information on chat that says there is an official petition site organized by the people of Tosashimizu to bring Manjiro's story to NHK Taiga Dorama. Taiga Dorama is a drama that is on NHK, a semi-public, private Japanese broadcasting station in Japan that goes on for a full year, and it usually portrays a historical figure. So
yeah, they excuse me, they tried to do that about 10 years ago, and we used to collect signatures and forward them over there for that same purpose, but it didn't happen then.
Maybe there's a second time. We should try this again the second time round, Rooney.
I think so, yes.
Another question is, actually, before I forget, this is an important question because there's a question that says, how can we get in touch with Rooney-san?
Oh, well, you can go on the website. You can email to me. The easiest email is GA-HANDS, like your hand, HANDS, at AOL.com.
And that's the email that they can use to, say, schedule a tour?
Yes, either one, or they can even call me if they're close enough at 508-995-1219, which is my home number.
Fantastic. And we should also, at this point, also tell people that Boston is an interesting city to visit if anybody is interested in the beginnings of America. And Fairhaven is not very far from Boston, right?
That's correct. I think it's a great idea. For example, there's the families in Chicago or any other part of the country that want to show their youngsters where it all started, to go to Boston and to see Bunker Hill and all these other places, and go down to Plymouth, where the Pilgrims came over. That's only 35 minutes down from Boston. And as you indicated, 1 hour from Boston, you come to Manjiro's second hometown, as we call it.
And in certain ways, I think I'm not exaggerating to say that is really almost the beginning of the US-Japan relationship.
I would think so.
So people can come and visit and see where America started, and they can also go to Fairhaven and see where the US-Japan relationship started.
That's so true. Exactly.
Okay. Getting back to history a little bit, was Manjiro part of the 1854 Anglo-Japanese Treaty?
That I'm not sure of. 1854 would have been when the Commodore Perry came back to Edo, and they opened those two ports. But the treaty itself, I'm not aware that he was part of it directly. It could be, but I'm just unaware of it.
And similar to that question, do you know, or can you speak a little more to the exclusion of Manjiro from the Kanagawa Treaty?
I'm not that great a historian. I'm afraid I can't really comment on that with any confidence.
Actually, getting back to a little bit to Manjiro's time in Fairhaven, is there any other people beside the Whitifield family that Manjiro became very close to, either friends from school or friends from the Naval Academy, not a Naval Academy, where he was learning navigation?
Well, a very interesting part of what we show when we do the Manjiro tour, or the Manjiro Trail. It's not actually in the brochure, but in 1940s, our president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Delano part of the family was his mother's family. Those grandparents had a summer home in Fairhaven. And when the president was a little boy, he came there, and his grandfather told him about Manjiro because he knew Manjiro. So in 1933, the president wrote a letter to Toichiro to let him know that I learned about your father from my grandfather in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and also found out that grandfather was part owner of the John Howland ship that saved Manjiro.
Wow, talk about connections that we don't read about in our history books.
Right. Yeah.
Very interesting. Marco Oka, thank you for sharing that there is a Jongmung Museum in Tosashimizu.
Yes.
Peninsula honoring John Manjiro. He is the pride of the people in Shikoku and, of course, of Japan. So, Jerry-san, I would assume that you've been there.
Yes, it's a relatively new museum in the same location, but redone, beautifully done, well done. And it's funny because when you enter there, the first room that you come to is actually the outside facade of the captain's house. So you look like you're going into our museum again.
That's wonderful. There's a little bit of Fairhaven in Tosashimizu.
Right, exactly.
Another question actually is about the Whitifield Manjiro Friendship Society. Besides the museum, is there anything else that the society does?
Well, when the Dr. Hinohara bought that house and had it renovated, the carriage house behind it was supposed to be done at the same time, but they ran out of funds. We are doing that right now, and we're going to create a cultural center in which we can then expand our offerings greatly. We have been teaching local teachers, probably I think about 75 teachers from the Rhode Island border to Cape Cod, all about Manjiro, the whaling industry, etc. We use a lot of books for that. And we teach, it was funny, we teach all kinds of Japanese cooking as well at different times. And so when we have the opportunity with the cultural center, we can expand greatly with manga clubs and Japanese chatting sessions for people that want to learn Japanese, etc.
There's a question that says, did Manjiro know or meet Yukichi Kuzawa?
Who?
Kuzawa Yukichi.
Yes, he was on the same ship with him on the Conrin Maru.
I think you mentioned that. This is the ship that he ended up having to steer because everybody got sick.
That's correct.
And this is the ship that used his knowledge, the knowledge that he gained of navigation.
Right. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And that's the ship that brought back the first sewing machine that ended up being Brothers Inc.
Yes. And a very famous, right? Brothers Inc.
Right. Exactly so.
Talking of Manjiro and ships, there's a question that says, do you know anything about Manjiro's ability as a harpooner or a boat steerer?
Well, what happened when he went out on that second journey, when they went around Africa, it turns out that the captain actually went mental. And he was laid off onto an island at one of the U.S. consulates. And then everyone in the ship went up a notch. It's a question, I've heard it different ways as to what assignment Manjiro got at that point in time. But he was very astute, and some people thought he was a boat steerer. But that is maybe a little jump for someone who's relatively new, because you really have to know what you're doing in that small boat when they go for what they call a Nantucket sleigh ride after that huge whale starts pulling you through the ocean.
There is actually a question from somebody who have been to your museum. This question says, I remember seeing lots of quilts and remember stories about people-to-people connection.
Right.
Not necessarily maybe Manjiro specific. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes, the grassroots summit is an exchange that is put on by CIE, Center for International Exchange, out of Tokyo. Our good friend David Janes runs the New York office of that, and also was instrumental in putting together the international drama transition we did before on Manjiro. But the let me see. Focus me again, I'm sorry.
So this question is about the quilts.
Oh, the quilts, you're right, I'm sorry. Yes, what happened was when they signed up to go, for example, one of the events was done in Texas one year. And so what happens, the folks in Japan will sign up for that Texas thing. It takes about maybe 10 days altogether. They come to Texas, they'll be hosted by local people that have involvement with Japan and the Japanese relationship. And then prior to actually leaving, they have an option of signing up to do a 2-day visit to one place in the USA before going home. And because it's a Manjiro thing, we're always the potential 2-day stop. So we often get someone on the phone and says, I got people signing up. I've got 22. Can you take 25? I mean, and we have to find homestay families for them just for 2 days, but that's fine. And one of the ladies who came with her husband and grandson was from Miyagi area. And she was a professional quilter, patchwork person, right? And she had one, she gave us a beautiful one, which is on a view in the 3rd floor in the back room. And then in the middle room, she sent a beautiful one back to us later on, which we also put on display. So yes, we have a huge number of quilts that also were brought over at our last Manjiro Festival. They came from Tosa Shimizu, from all those folks. So we have a great backlog of all of these things and waiting for larger things like our cultural center to make a better display.
And this will happen when the carriage is done?
Yes. And the outside is almost finished. It's getting close. And then we have to do the inside, of course, with the classrooms and so forth like that.
And so this would really, in the true sense, become the grassroots US-Japan people-to-people connection center. I
think so, yes. We've had enough. We had about a little over 8,000 visitors to the museum so far. And when I count them up, it's usually somewhere around 68% are Japanese, some living in USA and many coming. And we've had people from every continent except Antarctica. Maybe I'll get a polar bear someday, and maybe we'll do that one too.
Actually, Jerry-san, time flies when we're having a good conversation. I think this is the most appropriate question to ask you in the end. And this might be a little difficult question, or might not be. The question says, if Manjiro was here with us at this moment right now, what would he say to us?
What would he say to us? Well, I think one thing he would emphasize the basics of recognizing every individual as a person. People ask me very often, was he was Japanese? Was he looked down upon when he came here to this area? Not for a couple of reasons. I mean, junior high school kids or high school kids might have a little trouble, with each other. That's not unusual. But in any event, the harbor of New Bedford was the world harbor for whaling. And people from every place came and went there. They looked, they were tall and dark and bearded and whatever. And so he would not stand out in that regard. So I think he, as he went through whatever he went through with Commodore Perry and other things like that, looked ahead and had such a clear vision of what possibilities he brought back from the USA to Japan. I mean, the idea of voting, just voting. I mean, wow, even though it's a little bit mixed up here right now, but anyway, when he brought that back to Japan, that was really outsized. It was incredible. So I think his main thing would be to recognize the individuality of every person and afford them that outlook from your own point of view.
That is a beautiful message for all of us. Thank you for that. Thank you very much, Jerry-san. This was an enormous treat for us. I also like to thank the Japan American Society of Chicago for partnering with us to be able to bring this beautiful story of Manjiro. And I think a big shout out for everybody to visit the museum, because one, you will get to meet most likely you will get to meet Jerry-san in person, and to actually be in that space and actually be in Fairhaven. I think there is a huge benefit to that as well.